Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford Graduate School of Business.
And I'm Charlotte Kramer, a current undergraduate here at Stanford.
And we have with us here today Julia Neusner. Julia is the Climate Research and Operations Specialist for the International Refugee Assistance Program, an NGO. Julia is a remarkable person, graduate of the Stanford Law School, among other accolades. And interestingly, she was for a period the legal director of the Stanford Asylum Lab. And so in Julia, we have one of the world's most experienced people in dealing with both the law and the reality of human mobility. And Julia, we were fortunate to have you run a conference on climate change and human mobility recently. And thank you very much for coming to talk with us about it.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. It's a pleasure. And really enjoyed the conference. It went really well.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And Charlotte, you were there. What were your reactions to what went on at the conference?
I feel like coming into the conference, I didn't quite understand the connection between climate change and human mobility. I didn't understand what exactly that was going to look like. But then coming into the conference, I realized that this was really about the communities that are at the forefront of climate change, the ones that are experiencing it the most and the hardest and that are suffering the most because of it. So it was a really interesting and very raw conference.
Yeah, well, I know when I first saw that connection, I had that same reaction. And so, Julia, you brought together an incredible group. It was so diverse. Maybe you could give us some highlights.
Yeah, it was really a great experience being able to bring together practitioners, academics, advocates, and people who work directly in the field with impacted people who were able to bring quite diverse perspectives on these issues. So we had panels on displacement, kind of from a broad policy lens, the impact of climate change and climate-related disasters on people on the move. That included practitioners who do search and rescue in the desert at the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as lawyers who represent displaced people impacted by climate change. So I think just being able to bring all those people together and have them in conversation made for really rich panels.
Yeah, I also found it super interesting how we watched a film at the conference, the Between the Rains film, and the discussion with the filmmaker after. I thought that was a super cool inclusion as well. And then I have a question about one of the sessions that I missed, preventing displacement. I kind of wanted to see what your main takeaways were from that, because to me, it seems like this problem could be solved an awful lot if people never even had to displace in the first place, if there wasn't that issue of migrants putting themselves in dangerous situations in order to reach a new place.
Yeah, thanks so much for your thoughts about the film Between the Rains. I thought it was really, really powerful. This was a film about the Turkana and Narramara communities in northern Kenya and the impact of drought on these communities who weren't even really aware that they were being impacted by climate change, but it led to really severe violence. And we were fortunate to be able to have a virtual Q&A with the producer Andrew Brown. So I'm glad you found that powerful. So I thought it was really important to include the panel on preventing displacement because the importance of adaptation and just the recognition that most people impacted by climate change do not want to move. They want to be able to stay where they are. So there are a lot of people working on adaptation in place. And I thought that panel, we were able to bring together Chris Field, who of course is at Stanford and an expert on adaptation, as well as Barbara Simpson, who's also a Stanford professor in engineering. Chris Field brought the policy perspective. Barbara Simpson brought this engineering perspective, and we learned a little bit about sustainable building and like what needs to be done to create structures that withstand climate change impacts. And that perspective is often not included in law and policy discussions that I've been a part of. And then we had other academics who presented case studies from Miami and from Chelsea Ridenor and Ana Sanchez-Bachman, who presented a case study from Guatemala on policies that these places have put into place to keep folks from being displaced. So it was, it was really interesting to just hear how people with such different backgrounds who come at this issue from such different perspectives in conversation with one another to hear about what needs to be done to prevent displacement in the first place.
I heard you mention sort of policy and technology there. Do you think that one kind of outweighs the other in importance in this kind of issue? Is it kind of like, oh, if the policy was good, we wouldn't even need the technology? Or if there was enough technology, like there wouldn't be any issues? Or is there sort of a limiting factor?
They're both super important. And I think the science and technology people and the law and policy people need to spend more time in the same room. Because that's something that I've actually talked to Professor Simpson about this. We use different vocabulary where the work that we do is so deeply intertwined, but there's so rarely opportunities for people who come at this problem from such different angles to be in conversation with one another. So you can't really have one without the other. I think like effective adaptation, providing resources for effective adaptation requires the science and technology to tell us what that looks like, and we need the policy people to allocate sufficient funding to work on zoning, to be able to actually put these put the scientific developments in this area into practice. So they're both equally important, and Professor Simpson agreed with me that they need to spend more time.
Well, that's interesting, Julia, and thanks for that great question, Charlotte. I mean, so human behavior matters clearly here, and that gets shaped by policy, and the technology is what we have to work with. So it seems to me there's a third lens beyond the technical and the behavioral, which is really the moral. I mean, there's a huge environmental justice issue here. I just last night, we're recording this podcast on July 25th. And last night I got a Viber message from some friends in the Philippines where the Marikina River has backed up again after a super typhoon followed by a monsoon. And I have a long relationship with the shopkeepers and the people there going back every year. And we thought that was solved by policy. And therefore they didn't move because they thought they could continue to live there. And now they're under 12 feet of water and there's no potable water and there are real issues with disease and everything else. And I'm guessing that if that happened in the wealthy neighborhoods of any country, that our response would be different than having it happen in that context where there is a great deal of poverty. And it's a beautiful thing, the way the culture in the Philippines is such that the folks are very resilient and they get themselves through these incredibly difficult, just terrible events. But it seems so unfair that those who are suffering so much from the consequences of climate change, which, by the way, they're not nearly as responsible for creating as the wealthy people of the world are being put through this. I don't know. What's your reaction to that, Julia?
Yeah, that's awful. And it goes to, that's happening all over the world where the people least responsible for climate change from the countries that emit the least are the ones experiencing the most severe impacts of it. You mentioned that you thought that the policy solutions to enable these people to stay, and then the impacts that we're seeing of climate change are even worse than what scientists have predicted. So even in places where there is some adaptation happening, there's been a lot of displacement where displacement wasn't expected. And I think what you said is exactly right, that the wealthier areas have resources for adaptation. People in those places are going to be more likely to stay. Well, already we're seeing that in the poorest parts of the world, people have to move because their governments or private entities cannot pay for the types of adaptation that's needed to keep people where they are.
Yeah. So now for both of you, I'd love to ask the following question, okay? One of the great things about a conference like this is that it brings together, but by virtue of bringing together such different people and different views and perspectives, there are surprises. And, what surprised you, Julia? And then Charlotte, what surprised you?
The panel on border enforcement and climate-related hazards for displaced people, I found was really just a lot more powerful and emotional than I had expected. We had a number of folks who have worked directly with refugees. Jennifer Babai, who works with Black America's Immigrant Advocacy Center in El Paso. Shaw Drake, who works at Stanford as a clinical supervising attorney and who ran a program in Panama, the Darien Gap, and then Doerr Rodriguez, who's an activist and humanitarian aid provider at the Arizona border. And the things that they've seen are just horrifying. And I think that the impacts of climate change on people on the move who are displaced for a whole host of reasons, not necessarily because of climate, but then encounter deadly hazards because of climate change as they move to seek protection is just an element of this issue that is not discussed as much. And what these panelists described is just really heartbreaking. Dora has been providing aid to people people at the Arizona border where they're just seeing record temperatures year after year, and spoke about people who arrive at her reception center in need of life-saving aid, experiencing heat stroke, and other really severe heat-related diseases. What we're seeing with folks crossing the Darien Gap, the stretch of jungle connecting Panama and Colombia that we heard from Shaw Drake is absolutely horrifying. And then similar stories from Jennifer Babai at the Texas border. And all the while, the U.S. government and governments all over the world are responding to increasing numbers of people on the move by implementing more stricter border enforcement and policies that force people into these dangerous situations and leave people stranded at land borders where they're exposed to the elements. I was surprised just to hear how horrific these stories were, and I think I didn't realize the extent to which the U.S. policies were contributing to this climate-related harm.
I see. And Charlotte?
Yeah, I agree as well. I was really shocked by some of the presentations and some of the things that people were showing from, sort of the front lines of the migrant crisis. And I think on a similar wavelength, it was really nice to close the conference with this panel on storytelling and how narrative affects policy change, because I really felt that with every story, I was becoming more and more invested, involved. And I think there is just such a great capacity for change with the right kind of storytelling.
Oh, I love that, Charlotte. I mean, one of the, for you listeners, I mean, it's one of the challenges that over the course of this podcast series we've seen is that the information about what's going on in the world can be very daunting. But that doesn't mean we want to hide from that information. And it's remarkable that in a time when information flows so broadly, people think ubiquitously, we actually don't know we systematically screen out so much of the information that if we knew it would create that kind of response that you just gave, Charlotte. And so I really want to applaud you, Julia, for bringing this information out for us to see, because it can then motivate us to take positive action to make things better than they otherwise would have been.
I kind of left the conference feeling really sort of discouraged at the state of the world. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many people, they're suffering. It's terrible. Who's responsible? Who's going to take care of them? And I felt like the answer at times was a handful of NGOs and no one else, So who would you say is responsible? Who would you say is kind of at the forefront of helping people through climate change and moving?
That's a really good question. I would say primarily governments. Governments are able to, implement policy. International organizations, United Nations organizations, of course, are critical. But also, I mean, the entities that have the most control over whether we're able to meet sustainability goals and reverse this are the major corporations that are causing these CO2 emissions in the first place. So I would say those are the main actors who have the power to change this. That's interesting that your takeaway was that the nonprofit organizations are playing an important role here. And I think that goes into the storytelling. There's only so much that that nonprofit organizations can do, and I can speak from the organization I work for, International Refugee Assistance Project, that storytelling has been a major focus of our advocacy. The main project I'm working on right now is tracking individual stories of how climate is impacting folks who move for a variety of reasons, and maintaining a data set on that, so then we can report out and try to draw more awareness to what's happening, and understand the scope of the problem. So I think documenting what's going on, making recommendations is how nonprofits are able to plug into this problem. But at the end of the day, it's up to government and the major private corporations to make change happen.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's clear that the power to solve such a big problem is at the highest levels, including governments and the biggest corporations of the world. And as well, when I think about us as individuals, and so many of you listeners, when you hear about issues of sustainability, a natural reaction is to think about your behavior as a consumer. Environmental consumerism is often where people turn. But one thing that this conference and Julia's own life, to be frank, just sort of illustrates is that we can also respond to the changes in the world connected to sustainability as producers in terms of our job, our career. I could imagine if I graduated from the Stanford Law School, there might have been a lot of careers that would have completely ignored issues of sustainability. And yet, Julia, you went in a direction where you've devoted your life to this cause, and it's brought us to this point where we're revealing this information to folks who might not have heard about it, right? And in that sense, all of us are getting involved. So you listen, folks listening, each of us in our productive capacity can help play a role to, first of all, shine a light on these terrible tragedies.
Yeah, thanks for your kind words. I appreciate it. It's however people can plug into this issue. I hope they will. Not just displacement, but just things are changing a lot faster than anybody anticipated, as I said before, and the impacts on the vulnerable people around the world are really severe. And I actually came to the climate issue just from doing refugee advocacy broadly, and seeing that climate change is touching every other aspect of society and making it worse. And all of the forces that are driving people to leave their homes, targeted violence, extreme poverty, lack of access to sufficient food and water, is being exacerbated by climate disasters. And that's what I've found in my research. If you ask somebody why they came to the US-Mexico border, there's very unlikely that they'll mention climate change or a disaster. If you keep asking, the most common answer I've heard is targeted violence. But then if you keep on asking questions, well, have you been affected by droughts? Have you noticed that has extreme heat affected you? Have you experienced any storms? The answer is almost always yes, and you can begin to see connections between storms destroying crops, destroying people's livelihoods, and then organized criminal groups coming in to take advantage of the situation and establish their influence in affected places. So this is all to say, climate change is touching every humanitarian issue, and it's just so important to be aware of it, to document it, and to come into it however you can, whether it's through science, policy, law, direct aid on the ground, which is, I think, the most important element of this. And those folks don't get enough credit. I hope listeners will engage.
Oh, well, thanks for that. So what I'd like to do now is, as we wrap this up, is give each of you a final word. What would you like to tell our audience about climate change and human mobility? And we'll start with you, Charlotte, and then we'll go to you for the last word, Julia.
Yeah, I think, Julia, you summed it up pretty well. I especially like that quote, climate change is touching everything and making it worse. It's so true. And it's something was so clear in this conference and the entire conference series that I've been a part of. It's just, climate change does make everything worse, and it makes everything more complicated, and it's going to take an awful lot to solve a problem of this magnitude and of this sort of spread. But there's a lot of very intelligent people working on it, and there's a lot of talk in the space right now, which is at the very least a good thing.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. It's really hard to end on a hopeful note. It's doing this work has it's really been difficult to feel hopeful about it, and I think this conference really reinforced for me just how severe these problems are, and just the myriad ways in which climate change and disasters are affecting people's lives. And it's not just, we spoke mostly about vulnerable populations. That's, my organization works with refugees. But it's affecting all of us. We've had the hotter summers than we've ever had before. In the United States, we're seeing record displacement, and stopping it is going to require a lot of coordination. Reversing it at this point is impossible. And I hope that what people will take away from the conference and just from the work that the panelists are doing to shed light on this issue is that we need more compassionate policies for people on the move and just for vulnerable people in general. Instead of policies restricting movement across borders, we need more permissive policies to enable people to leave uninhabitable land and come to places where they have the resources they need to survive. It's just Professor Barnett said earlier, this is a global justice issue, and we need to think about it that way, and to ensure that people have what they need to survive, where they're in places that are not super climate vulnerable, and the people who are in places that are going to get destroyed in the near future need to be able to move safely and with dignity.
Boy, that's so well put, Julia. So Julia Neusner, Charlotte Kramer, thank you very much. And to you listeners, from me, Bill Barnett, until next time. The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.